In the spring of 2003, Della Voss, no, let me use a name not in that list. Let me write the story directly. In the spring of 2003, Neva Hartwell was 29 years old, and she was told, not asked, not consulted, but told that the river running through the back third of her family's maple farm in the Laurentians was about to be diverted. She was sitting across a laminate table in a rented boardroom in Saint-Agathe-des-Monts when they told her. The room smelled of stale coffee and photocopier toner. 3 men from a Montreal development firm had driven up that morning in 2 separate vehicles, which told her something right away about how they felt about each other and about how little they needed to coordinate before walking into a room with a woman like her. Their lead man was named Mr. Voss. He had a firm handshake and a fleece vest with a corporate logo she didn't recognize. He set a laminated rendering on the table between them, a 4-season resort complex called Domaine Nordique with a water feature running through the heart of it, fed by a redirected tributary of the Rivière du Lièvre, her tributary. Let me tell you what that rendering looked like. It looked like someone had taken the land her grandmother had worked for 40 years and smoothed all the irregular human parts out of it. The sugar bush was still there, reduced to a tasteful cluster of trees in the background of a photograph of a couple drinking wine on a stone terrace. The maple lines, the old iron spiles, the miles of tubing her father had strung through the trees were gone entirely. In their place, a heated outdoor pool and a parking structure for 200 vehicles. Mr. Voss explained the situation with the particular patience of someone who has explained the same situation many times and expects no surprises. The development had the blessing of the municipal council. Environmental review was underway. The diversion was technically legal, pending final permits. They wanted to acquire the rear 40 hectares of Hartwell land to facilitate access and to manage the watercourse. They were prepared to be generous. He slid a folder across the table. Neva did not open it. She looked past him, through the window, at the parking lot outside, where the 2 company vehicles sat side by side. She thought about the river. She thought about how it sounded in late April when the ice broke, a low, grinding conversation that she had fallen asleep to every spring of her life. She thought about her grandmother, Constance, who had waded into that same river every July to check the depth of the current, wearing rubber boots that came up to her thighs, and a look of absolute authority. "The land is not for sale," Neva said. The man to Mr. Voss's left made a small sound, not quite a laugh, more like an adjustment. Mr. Voss nodded slowly. The way people nod when they are being tolerant. "We understand there's an emotional component here, Miss Hartwell. That's completely natural. But I want you to understand the scope of what's coming. The development will proceed with or without your cooperation. The question is whether you benefit from it or simply endure it." He folded his hands. "You're running a maple operation, a seasonal business. A good one, I'm sure. But the traffic patterns that come with a resort of this scale, the access roads, the infrastructure, the noise during construction, it will fundamentally change the character of this area. You may find that farming becomes, well, difficult." "I'll manage," Neva said. He was right about one thing. He could not have imagined the rest. Now, let me explain something about Neva. She was not the kind of person who raised her voice at council meetings or wrote letters to the editor. Her grandmother had not been that kind of person either. Constance Hartwell had come to the Laurentians in 1961 with a husband, $200, and an ambition that had nothing to do with being recognized for it. She had tapped her first tree in 1963. By 1975, she was producing some of the finest amber maple syrup in the province. She never advertised. She never applied for a grant. She just kept working, kept learning, kept listening to the trees and the weather and the particular silence that settled over the sugar bush in February before the sap started to run. She had died 3 years before the men in the boardroom arrived, leaving the farm to Neva's mother. And then, when her mother's health declined to Neva, she had left one other thing as well, a practice of paying attention. There was an evening Neva remembered clearly. She must have been 14. She and her grandmother were walking the back lines in the early dark, checking the tubing for freeze damage. Constance had stopped beside a maple that was perhaps 80 years old, its bark thick and ridged as old rope, and placed both palms flat against it. "They'll want this someday," she had said, not looking at Neva, but at the tree. People with money always want the thing they can't build. They can build a hotel. They can build a restaurant. They cannot build an 80-year-old maple tree. They cannot build February. She had pulled her hands away from the bark and kept walking. So don't let them tell you what your February is worth. Neva had thought about that conversation often in the years since. She thought about it on the drive home from Santa Gea that afternoon, the folder from Mr. Voss sitting unopened on the passenger seat. The construction began that August. If you have never lived beside a large construction project, let me tell you that it is a particular kind of endurance. It is not dramatic. No one moment breaks you. It is cumulative. It is the 6 a.m. backup alarms of excavators. It is the dust that settles on the leaves of your maple trees and has to be considered when you're calculating the health of the canopy. It is the company rep who comes to your door in October, polite and apologetic, to explain that a section of access road has been rerouted and will now run within 40 meters of your property line, and that this was an oversight, and that they are very sorry, and that the offer they made you in the spring has been updated. And he sets a new folder on your kitchen table with a slightly higher number on the cover page. Neva left that folder on the table and made him tea. The whispers in town had a particular flavor. The Laurentians are not an unkind place, but they are a practical one. People who had known her grandmother talked about the family with a mixture of admiration and pity, the way you talk about someone standing very still on a dock while the water rises around them. "She's holding out," they said. "Good for her. But holding out for what? They have the permits. The river is already rerouted on the plans." A man at the hardware store in Mont-Tremblant told her without being unkind that she was fighting the tide with a broom. She smiled and bought her screws and went home. There was a night, and I want you to know about this night because it is the kind of thing that gets left out of stories when they are told afterward. It came in the second winter of construction, in January, during a cold snap that drove temperatures down to -32. She had been up since 4 in the morning, checking the taps on the evaporator, making sure the pipes hadn't frozen late. The lights of the half-finished resort building glowed from the hill above the eastern tree line, orange and artificial, like a wound in the dark. One of the old spiles in the back section had cracked in the cold, and she had spent 2 hours in the bush at night in the beam of a headlamp, working with bare hands for the last 20 minutes because her gloves had soaked through. When she got back to the house, the fire had gone down to coals. The kitchen was cold. Her hands were not working properly. She stood at the sink, running warm water over them, and looked out the window at the orange glow on the hill. And for the first time in 2 years, she thought, maybe they're right. Maybe this is foolish. Maybe the practical thing, the sane thing, is to take what they're offering and find somewhere quieter, somewhere without all of this, and start again. She crossed to the table. Both folders were still there. Her grandmother's handwriting was on a piece of paper underneath them, a note from the estate paperwork, just a list of field names in Constance's careful cursive, the back 40, the creek section, the old stand. Ordinary words, a record of ordinary work. Neva stood there for a long time. Then she made a pot of tea, put the folders in a kitchen drawer, and sat by the stove until her hands came back. She did not doubt again after that. Domaine Nordique opened in December of 2005. It was in every surface way exactly what Mr. Voss had promised. A 4-season resort with 120 rooms, 2 restaurants, a Nordic spa fed by the rerouted tributary, 300 meters of artificially sustained cross-country ski trails, and a lobby decorated with enormous black and white photographs of the Laurentian landscape. Heritage aesthetic, they called it in the brochure. The photographs included, if you looked carefully, the tops of maple trees. The resort sat on the hill above her property. From the upper floors of the lodge, from the deck of the spa, you could see the Hartwell farm laid out below, the sugar house with its metal roof, the long rows of tapped maples in February, catching the light, the old farmhouse with smoke coming from its chimney. It was, the resort's marketing team quickly discovered, exactly the kind of image their guests wanted to see: rural authenticity. The real Quebec, a connection to something older and slower than the thing they were paying $1,200 a night for. At first, it was background scenery. Guests would stand on the spa deck with their glasses of vin chaud and point down at the farm. Couples photographed each other with the sugar house in the background. In the resort's first spring, a woman from Toronto asked the front desk if it was possible to buy maple syrup from that place down there, and was told politely that the resort had its own maple products, sourced from a commercial supplier in Brome-Missisquoi. The woman bought a jar at checkout anyway, and reviewed the resort online with 3 stars. She gave the syrup 5. Word of this reached Neva through a friend who worked at the resort's front desk. Neva filed it away. The first contact that changed everything was unremarkable in the way that turning points often are. A family from Ottawa, parents, 2 teenagers, had come to the resort in March for the Nordic skiing. On their second afternoon, the teenagers declared themselves bored of skiing, which is the declaration that cost parents the most money in resort environments. The father, a man named Mr. Beaulieu, had walked out to the edge of the resort's property to get some air. He was standing at the fence line when Neva came around the tree line on her snowshoes, checking a section of tubing. They started talking the way strangers talk in the outdoors, slowly about nothing, and then about something. He asked about the trees. She told him about the tapping season, about how a good maple year depends on the right sequence of freezing nights and warm days, about how her grandmother had always said February was doing its own slow arithmetic. He asked if they could see it. The operation, he meant. The actual process. She thought about it for a moment. Then she said yes. The 4 of them came the next morning, still in their resort clothes, a little overdressed for a sugar bush. Neva lent them work boots from the rack by the door. She walked them through the back lines, showed them the spiles and the tubing, explained what the trees were doing in the cold. In the sugar house, she showed them the evaporator, the steam rising off the sap as it cooked down, the slow color change from clear to gold to amber. She let them stir the syrup at the finishing stage. She gave them each a small jar at the end. They stood in her kitchen afterward and drank tea and did not want to leave. The teenagers, who had not spoken voluntarily to an adult in 3 days, asked questions for 40 minutes. The father shook her hand when they left. "How much do we owe you?" he asked. She had not thought about that. She named a number on the spot. It was modest, and it was exactly right, and by the time the family reached the resort's lobby, they had already told 2 other couples about it. Let me stop here and ask you something. Have you ever watched something you built start to matter to other people in ways you didn't plan? Neva had built nothing new. She had only kept what was already there. But in the context of everything that surrounded it now, what was already there had become something rare. She painted a small sign that weekend. She put it at the end of her lane, visible from the resort's lower trail. It said, Hartwell Sugar Bush Tours, March and April by appointment. The first weekend, 6 people called. The second weekend, 14. By the third week of March, the resort's concierge desk was fielding more requests about the farm tour than about any of their own programming. Guests were showing up to ski and spending their afternoons in Neva's sugar house instead. The resort's cross-country trail maintenance crew started finding rental skis left in small, inexplicable piles at the edge of the property. Guests who had simply abandoned their afternoon on the trails and walked down to the farm and not come back. Inside the resort's management office, this registered as a data problem before it registered as anything else. Afternoon ski rental returns were down. The spa's lunch service was underperforming. Guests who should have been spending their mid-afternoon in the resort's bistro at $38 a plate were somewhere off property and apparently very happy about it. They sent someone to find out what was happening. A junior marketing coordinator named Mr. Boudreau, who had grown up in Laval and had never been inside a working sugar house, went down one Thursday afternoon and came back to the office 2 hours later, smelling of wood smoke and maple steam, with a small jar of syrup in his coat pocket and a somewhat dazed expression. They're just standing around watching her boil sap, he reported. And they won't leave. Management convened. The numbers from the second half of March told a clear story. Afternoon resort revenue was 12% below projection. Guest satisfaction scores were, paradoxically, the highest they had ever recorded. Comment after comment cited the farm experience as the highlight of the trip. The resort had spent $4 million on a Nordic spa that guests were leaving mid-treatment to go watch a woman in rubber boots feed wood into an evaporator. There was a particular detail that became something of a running joke among the resort staff. Guests who went down to the Hartwell farm for the afternoon would invariably lose track of time. The sugar house had no clock on the wall. There was no Wi-Fi. There was the fire and the steam, and Neva talking about the trees. And somehow 2 hours would pass, and people would surface back into the present tense looking slightly astonished. The way you look when you've slept better than you expected to. These guests, returning to the resort in the early evening, would realize their ski rentals were still on the lower trail. The resort had to dispatch a staff member each afternoon at 4 o'clock to collect abandoned equipment from the fence line at Neva's property. 1 pair of skis became 3, became 7, became, on a busy Saturday in late March 2019 pairs of rental skis and 11 sets of poles arranged in a row against the cedar fence like a very orderly surrender. Management hired a dedicated equipment retrieval person. His job, officially, was guest services support. His actual job was to drive a snowmobile down to the Hartwell property every afternoon and collect the equipment that the resort's own guests had walked away from in order to learn about maple trees. The irony of it was not lost on anyone, least of all on the resort's general manager, a man named Mr. Dauphin, who had been in the hospitality industry for 22 years and had never encountered anything like it. He came to see Neva on a Wednesday in April 2008, not with a folder, not with an offer. He came alone in a personal vehicle and knocked on the farmhouse door. She invited him in and gave him tea and a plate of oatcakes, and after a few minutes of ordinary conversation, he said, with what appeared to be genuine bewilderment, "How are you doing this?" Neva set down her mug. She thought about how to answer honestly. "I'm not doing anything that wasn't already here," she said. "You built something your guests could have found anywhere. I just kept something they couldn't find anywhere else." He was quiet for a moment. "We spent $4 million on that spa," he said. "I know," she said, "and people like it. But they drive 4 hours to get here, and when they arrive they still want to know if the maple syrup is real." She looked out the window at the sugar bush, the trees bare now in the April mud, the tubing lines catching the afternoon light. "It turns out real is hard to come by." Mr. Dauphin sat with that. Outside, somewhere on the upper trail, a snowmobile was doing its afternoon run to retrieve the abandoned skis. "My board is going to ask me what I recommend," he said finally. "That's your business," Neva said. What followed was not a partnership in any document signing, press release, sense of the word. It was something quieter and more durable. Domaine Nordique's premium packages began including a farm tour as a listed feature, not an affiliate experience. Not a referral, a feature, something the resort was, in effect, acknowledging it could not provide itself. They did not acquire her property. They did not need to. She was already doing the thing they needed done, and she was doing it in a way that could not be replicated by scaling it up or hiring staff to manage it. You cannot train someone to be the third generation of a working farm. You cannot manufacture the kind of knowledge that lives in a person's hands and comes from 50 years of the same work in the same place. The waiting list for a Hartwell farm tour grew to 6 weeks by 2010. Neva added one thing, a small table near the sugar house window, 4 chairs, where at the end of each tour she served fresh syrup on snow, the old Quebec way, the tire durable her grandmother had made for her. When she was small, the syrup poured hot onto packed snow and rolled onto a wooden stick. People ate it standing up in their borrowed work boots, and the steam from the sugar house and the silence that came over them in that moment was the most expensive thing on the property. She never expanded. She never hired a marketing person. The table stayed at 4 chairs. The tours stayed small. She could have done more, run more groups, built a larger facility, licensed the name. People told her so, often, with the enthusiastic encouragement of people who don't have to do the work. She smiled and kept the table at 4 chairs. Now let me tell you what the Hartwell farm looks like today. Neva is in her early 50s. The gray at her temples is the color of the sky before a sap run. Not winter gray, not summer gray, but the particular silver of a March morning that could go either way. She still does the morning check of the lines herself. Some things she will not delegate. The farm is debt-free and productive. The maple herd, as her grandmother used to call the trees, is one of the most carefully maintained in the Laurentians. The resort has changed ownership twice. The new operators spent considerable money on a rebrand in 2019 and then discovered, as their predecessors had, that their highest-rated guest experience was something they did not own and could not control. Their current website features a photograph of the Hartwell Sugar House on the homepage. They did not ask permission. Neva noticed and let it go. The photograph is good. The equipment retrieval snowmobile still runs its afternoon loop. It has become, over the years, a kind of institutional memory, a reminder, written into the resort's daily operations, of who was there first and what the guests were actually looking for. And if you visit the farm on a morning in March before the tours start, you might find Neva in the back lines with a younger woman beside her, her niece, who drove up from Gatineau 3 years ago for a weekend and has not entirely left. You might see Neva hand her a rubber mallet and a fresh spile and show her how to tap a tree that her grandmother tapped 50 years before. You might hear her say, "Listen, not to the tree, although that too, but to the whole thing, the cold, the light on the snow, the quality of silence that means the sap is about to run." The men in the boardroom came and saw a seasonal farm operation in the path of progress. They saw an asset to be acquired and a problem to be managed. They thought the story was about a resort being built on a hillside. They were wrong. The story was always about what was in the valley. The resort was a distraction, a loud, expensive, 4-star distraction. They called her operation a vulnerability. She kept working, and the maples kept running, and the land remembered everything.